It was an ordinary afternoon in Austin, Texas. The local supermarket bustled with life, shopping carts rolling down the aisles, cash registers beeping steadily, and quiet conversations between customers filling the air. People went about their routines, focused on their lists, comparing prices, and occasionally greeting familiar faces. It was just another day, until it wasn't. Near the dairy aisle, Nancy Harper, a 62-year-old woman, stood with her designer handbag slung over her arm. Her blonde hair was neatly styled, and her posture exuded an air of quiet entitlement. As she reached for a carton of whole milk, she muttered to herself about how much prices had gone up. At the same time, Jordan Carter, a 32-year-old black man, approached the same section. Dressed casually in a gray t-shirt and jeans, he carried a basket already half filled with groceries, eggs, bread, a pack of bottled water. He was checking his phone, absent-mindedly scrolling through a message while reaching for a carton of almond milk nearby. Then it happened. "You people don't belong here." Jordan barely registered the words at first. He was in his own world, focused on his task. But something about the tone, sharp, cold, dripping with hostility, made him pause. He glanced up, unsure if the words were even directed at him. Nancy Harper's blue eyes locked onto his. Her lips were pursed, her expression rigid, as if she had just swallowed something bitter. She wasn't mumbling to herself anymore. She was speaking deliberately. At him. Jordan blinked. "Did I just hear that right?" Before he could process, she said it again. "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" This time, there was no mistaking it. Her voice was louder, cutting through the supermarket's usual hum like a blade. The air in the store suddenly felt heavier. Conversations died mid-sentence. A mother shopping with her toddler, who had been selecting a box of cereal just a few feet away, suddenly turned her cart in the opposite direction, steering her child away from the tension. A store employee, who had been stocking shelves near the cereal section, froze, his hands gripping a box of Frosted Flakes. His face was a mix of unease and uncertainty. Should he step in, or would that make things worse? A young cashier at the express checkout lane, no older than 20, craned her neck to get a better look, sensing something was happening. Jordan's fingers hovered over his phone screen. His heart pounded, though his face remained still. He wasn't a stranger to ignorance. He had dealt with microaggressions before. People clutching their purses when he walked by, being watched too closely in stores, but this was different. This was direct, blunt, ugly. For a moment, he just stood there, feeling the weight of the eyes now on him. He could feel the unspoken tension, the uncomfortable shifting of the people nearby. Some pretended not to hear. Others exchanged glances, but said nothing. Nancy Harper stood her ground, gripping her milk carton tightly, her chin slightly lifted as if expecting a reaction. Jordan exhaled slowly. His initial instinct was to snap back, to put her in her place, to say something cutting, something that would make her feel the same sting she had just tried to inflict on him. But instead, he took a breath. A long, steadying breath. If he was going to respond, he was going to do it his way. The store, once filled with the usual noise of everyday life, was now wrapped in silence. Everyone was waiting. Nancy Harper didn't back down. She squared her shoulders, tightening her grip on the carton of milk as if bracing for impact. Her lips pressed together in a thin, defiant line, her sharp blue eyes locked onto Jordan's face. There was no hesitation in her posture, only expectation, as if she was daring him to respond. The energy in the store shifted. A woman near the bread aisle, who had been browsing quietly just moments ago, froze mid-step, her fingers still resting on a bag of dinner rolls. A young man in a baseball cap stood near the produce section, pretending to inspect an avocado, but his eyes darted toward the confrontation. Even the cashier at the express checkout lane, a girl barely in her 20s, craned her neck to see what was happening. Her scanning motion slowed, her fingers hesitating over a pack of gum on the counter. A store employee stacking cans of soup in the next aisle had stopped working altogether, standing awkwardly with a can in his hand. The once normal bustle of the supermarket had slowed to a crawl, an unnatural hush settling over the dairy section as people either watched or desperately tried to pretend they weren't listening. Jordan felt all of it. The weight of the moment pressed against him like a physical force, thick and suffocating. He could feel the silent expectations of those around him, some hoping he'd ignore it, some hoping he'd fight back, and others simply holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. He could have reacted in anger. He could have yelled, thrown words back at her like daggers, matching hate with hate. He could have stormed off, shaking his head, pretending it didn't matter when, deep down, it did. He could have caused a scene, raised his voice, demanded justice. But instead, he did something else. He let out a slow, controlled breath, shifting the weight of his basket of groceries from one hand to the other. With measured deliberation, he set the basket down beside him, the soft thud against the tile floor almost lost in the heavy silence of the store. Then, lifting his eyes to meet hers, he spoke. "Ma'am." His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable strength behind it. "Do you even realize what you just said?" His words weren't aggressive, but they weren't weak either. They held weight, deliberate, measured, unshakable. Nancy's expression darkened, her grip tightening on her milk carton. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." A gasp escaped from a woman near the bakery, her hand flying up to her mouth. The young man in the baseball cap shook his head, his jaw tightening as he exchanged a glance with another shopper. A few more customers, sensing the growing tension, stopped what they were doing and slowly edged closer, some pretending to browse nearby shelves while keeping their ears tuned to the conversation. Jordan's hands clenched at his sides, but his face remained neutral. Not because he didn't feel the anger bubbling underneath his skin, but because he refused to let it dictate his actions. His father had always told him that moments like these defined a person not just in what they said, but how they chose to say it. Nancy was watching him closely, her expression almost eager, like she wanted to fight. Jordan, however, wasn't going to give her one. Instead, he simply stood taller, his presence growing in the silence. He could feel the eyes of the store on him, now expecting something, anything. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, clear, and undeniable. "Let's talk about that," he said, his tone even but firm. "Since you brought it up." And in that moment, the entire grocery store held its breath. Instead of reacting with anger, Jordan took a different approach. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he stood tall, squared his shoulders, and locked eyes with Nancy. She was still gripping her milk carton, her fingers tightening around it, as if holding onto her conviction. But something in her posture had shifted just slightly. She wasn't as sure of herself as she had been seconds ago. Jordan let the silence stretch for just a moment longer, then finally spoke. "Let's talk about that," he said, his voice clear, firm. "Since you brought it up." The words seemed to echo through the store. A few more people moved closer, subtly inching toward the dairy section. Some shoppers who had been pretending not to listen stopped altogether, their carts abandoned mid-aisle. The atmosphere felt different now, thicker, heavier, charged with an expectation that something important was about to happen. Jordan's voice was steady, filled with quiet strength, and when he spoke again, he didn't rush his words. He wanted them to sink in. "You say I don't belong here," he continued, his tone measured. "But let me tell you exactly where I come from." He let a brief pause hang in the air before beginning. "My great-grandfather was born in Alabama." He let the words settle before going on. "He worked the land from sunrise to sunset, breaking his back day after day, but he never owned a single acre of it. His father, my great-great-grandfather, was born into slavery, taken from his home, stripped of his name, forced to work, beaten, sold like property." He took a breath. "And for what?" "To build the very country you're standing in. My grandfather served in Vietnam. He fought for a country that sent him overseas to risk his life, but treated him like a second-class citizen when he came home." His voice hardened slightly. He couldn't sit at the same lunch counters, couldn't use the same restrooms, couldn't even vote without being threatened. "And my parents? They worked hard, paid their taxes, raised me to believe in kindness, respect, and hard work. My mother was a teacher, dedicating her life to helping kids. Kids who looked like me and kids who looked like you. My father was a mechanic. The kind of man who would stop on the side of the road to help anyone, maybe even you, if your car broke down." The store was silent now. The refrigerators that had been humming moments ago seemed quieter. The rustling of shopping bags, the beep of checkout scanners, the murmur of casual conversations, all of it had faded into the background. Nancy stood there, her jaw tight, her knuckles white against the handle of her shopping cart. She opened her mouth as if to interrupt, but no words came. Jordan wasn't finished. His voice softened. but his words held the same power. And you're telling me I don't belong here? He shook his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Ma'am, my family has been in this country for generations, maybe even longer than yours. A ripple went through the crowd. A woman near the frozen food section pressed a hand to her chest. A young man in a denim jacket, who had been pretending to look at yogurt, exhaled sharply, shaking his head. A cashier behind the self-checkout area paused in the middle of bagging groceries, her eyes locked on Jordan. The weight of his words lingered in the air, pressing down on everyone. Nancy's fingers trembled slightly on the milk carton. She hadn't expected this. She had expected anger. She had expected an argument. Maybe even an insult hurled back at her. But this was something else. For the first time since she had spoken, she looked uncertain. And in that moment, no one in the grocery store moved. Nancy gripped the milk carton tightly, her knuckles turning white against the plastic. The cold from the refrigerated section pressed against her palm, but she barely noticed. Her face had lost some of its color, her once defiant expression cracking ever so slightly. She hadn't expected this. She had expected anger, a quick retort, maybe even a heated argument. But instead, Jordan had met her hostility with history, with truth, with undeniable facts. And now, standing in the center of the dairy aisle, surrounded by strangers, she was suddenly aware of something else. She was alone. A middle-aged man, broad-shouldered with a mustache and a worn-out flannel shirt, took a slow step forward. His voice was rough, as if he hadn't spoken in a while. "He's right," he said, clearing his throat. "We have to do better than this." His words seemed to break a spell. An older woman near the frozen foods aisle, her gray curls pinned neatly under a scarf, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Her hand shook slightly as she spoke. "My brother served in Vietnam too," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He always said we fought for all Americans, not just some." Her words hit the air like a gentle but undeniable force, weaving through the silence, making Nancy's shoulders tighten. Nancy's eyes darted around the store, scanning the faces of the people around her. For the first time, she wasn't searching for someone to argue with, she was searching for an ally. But none came. Instead, the young cashier at the register, barely 20, stepped forward, her voice breaking the tension. "That was the most graceful way I've ever seen anyone handle something like this," she said, looking directly at Jordan. "Thank you." Nancy opened her mouth, as if to defend herself, to explain, to justify her words, but the words wouldn't come. She hesitated, her lips parting slightly before closing again. She swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't mean," she started, but the sentence died in her throat. Jordan sighed, his expression softening just slightly. He had seen this before, people who spoke without thinking, people who had been taught the wrong things for too long, people who didn't even understand the weight of their own words until it was too late. He could have let it in there. He could have left her to deal with her own discomfort, her own realization. But instead, he met her eyes and said, "It's not about what you meant. It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more." A long, heavy pause settled over the store. Then, suddenly, a single clap echoed through the space. It came from the man in the flannel shirt, his large hands coming together in slow, deliberate applause. Then, someone else joined in. And another. And another. Within seconds, the entire front of the store was clapping. It wasn't a cheering, celebratory kind of applause, it was something deeper, something more powerful. It was acknowledgement, agreement, respect. Nancy's face flushed red. The heat crawled up her neck as she glanced around once more, this time with nowhere to turn. The clapping didn't stop. She looked down, adjusting the strap of her expensive handbag, gripping her shopping cart a little too tightly. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked toward the exit, her footsteps quick, her head slightly lowered. The crowd watched her go. And as the automatic doors slid open and she disappeared into the parking lot, the applause slowly faded, leaving behind a different kind of silence. A silence that felt changed. As Jordan approached the checkout line, the store's usual energy began to return. The rhythmic beeping of the registers, the murmur of casual conversation, the rustling of plastic bags, life resumed as if nothing had happened. But it had. The young cashier who had spoken up earlier was now standing behind the counter, scanning his groceries. Her hands moved quickly, sliding each item over the scanner, but her eyes flickered up toward him every so often. She hesitated for a second before speaking. "That really meant a lot," she said softly. "Most people would have just walked away." Jordan glanced at her name tag, Emily. She looked no older than 20, with a kindness in her expression that made her seem even younger. He offered her a small but genuine smile. "Sometimes you have to say something," he said as he grabbed his bag of groceries. "But anger only builds walls. Grace breaks them down." Emily nodded, as if committing his words to memory. As Jordan walked through the automatic doors and stepped into the Texas evening, the golden glow of the setting sun stretched across the parking lot. The heat from the pavement rose up in waves, carrying the scent of asphalt and warm air. He spotted his car a few rows away, but before he could reach it, he noticed something. Nancy Harper was still there. She sat inside her silver sedan, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Through the windshield, he could see her face drawn, pale, lost in thought. She hadn't left. She hadn't driven off in frustration. She was just sitting there, thinking. For a brief moment, Jordan considered walking over to her. Maybe he could say something else. Maybe this was the moment for a real conversation. But then, he decided against it. Some lessons take time to settle. He had already said what needed to be said. With a quiet sigh, he turned away and headed for his car. As he drove off, Nancy remained frozen in place, her eyes distant, her mind replaying everything that had just happened. That evening, Jordan sat at his mother's kitchen table, the smell of simmering chili filling the air. His mother, a strong but gentle woman in her late 50s, stirred the pot, tasting the broth before adding a pinch of seasoning. Jordan recounted the entire event: the grocery store, Nancy's words, the crowd's reaction, and the moment of silence that had changed everything. His mother listened intently, her hands steady, her eyes sharp with wisdom. When he finished, she set the spoon down and turned to him. "You did the right thing," she said finally. Her voice was calm but firm, the way it had always been when she wanted her words to truly sink in. Jordan exhaled, nodding slightly, but she wasn't finished. "Not just for yourself," she continued, "but for everyone who was watching. People like her, they don't change overnight. But you planted a seed, and that's all you can do sometimes." Jordan thought about that. A seed, not a victory, not an argument won, but something small, something subtle, something that given time might grow into understanding. Across town, in a quiet, dimly lit house, Nancy Harper sat at her dining table. A plate of untouched food sat before her. The ice in her glass of tea had long since melted. Her home was silent, but inside her mind, it wasn't. Jordan's words played on a loop, unshakable, undeniable. "It's not about what you meant. It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more." She had been so sure of herself at the store, so firm in her beliefs. But now, for the first time in a very long time, she felt something she hadn't expected. Doubt. And that doubt, as uncomfortable as it was, stayed with her. The story of what happened at the grocery store didn't end when Jordan walked away. It began to spread slowly at first, then like ripples in a pond. People who had been in the store that day went home and told their families. A man recounted it to his wife over dinner, shaking his head in amazement at the way Jordan had handled the situation with such calm and dignity. A teenage girl who had been near the self-checkout line shared the story with her friends, explaining how she had never seen someone respond to hate with such quiet strength. Within a few days, the story had made its way through the neighborhood. Jordan never sought attention for what he had done. He hadn't recorded the moment. He hadn't posted about it on social media. He had simply spoken the truth when it needed to be said. But his words had rippled beyond that grocery store. At the gym, a man Jordan had never spoken to before stopped him by the free weights. "Hey, man, I heard about what happened at the store." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Oh." The man nodded, setting down a dumbbell. "Yeah, that was powerful. Most people would have just let it slide or lost their temper. But you," he shook his head in admiration. "You handled it with grace." At work, his coworkers approached him with quiet nods of respect. Even while waiting in line for coffee, a woman in front of him turned and said, "I just wanted to thank you. I wasn't there, but I heard. And I wish more people handled things the way you did." Jordan wasn't sure how to respond. He hadn't done it for recognition. He hadn't done it for praise. He had done it because it was right. Even Nancy Harper changed slowly, quietly. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't dramatic. But something inside her had shifted. She found herself thinking about Jordan's words in the quiet moments: the early mornings as she sipped her coffee, the evenings as she folded laundry, the times when she walked through that same grocery store and passed by the dairy aisle. She found herself questioning the beliefs she had held for so long. Where had they come from? Had she ever truly examined them? Had she ever really listened to someone else's story? For the first time in her life, she wanted to understand. She didn't know if she'd ever see Jordan again. But if she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to say the two words she should have said that day. I'm sorry. Final message. This story is a powerful reminder that words and actions matter. They can divide, or they can unite. They can wound, or they can heal. Standing up against hate doesn't always mean shouting the loudest. It means speaking with truth, dignity, and strength. It means choosing grace over anger. It means planting seeds of change, even when you may never see them grow. Let this be a reminder. Choose kindness. Choose courage. And always, always choose to stand up for what's right.